Do you mind putting your phone in your lap? Because we just see it on the video.
All right, we'll run through some quick mic checks, and then we'll get you off and running.
This one's about hip-hop therapy, so you don't have to be worried, Matt.
All right, we'll just do a quick mic check, just like count to 10 on the red microphone.
That's fine.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Beautiful. And then Jessica.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
All right, sounds good to me.
Can you turn my headphones up a little bit? I'm like hard of hearing today to hear him.
Should I talk louder or?
Is that any better?
that-
I mean,
I can hear myself like
Am
my.
I just?
follow the headphone cable back to the amp in front of you, and then you can turn yourself up.
Okay.
One you're plugged into.
Oh,
Should I
awesome.
turn myself down?
Oh,
Okay,
awesome.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, maybe you can.
Mm-hmm.
On the
This?
The one next to it, to the right, the one you're plugged into. Yep.
This one right here?
Yep. We can turn that up or down.
Okay. Cool.
is that better for you?
Yeah. I think so.
Let's see those, right?
Yeah, whatever.
Should be fine.
Cool. How would you like me to introduce you?
However.
Aaron Rodwin.
Yeah.
Rodwin.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Ready to
cool. I guess we're rolling, right?
Or the
Yes.
K and Peel AA Ron. I'm joking. You know.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Okay, so Aaron, as we were talking about outside, I always like to start our interview thinking about how we come into this world and how we approach the world. So what I asked you outside is something I've been trying to struggle with myself too, but when you think about how do you want people to remember you as a person?
Right. It's a loaded question. I think something that's always driven me is my interest in just like human well-being and human suffering, and like I want to be coming up with really creative ways of trying to help people talk about difficult things who've experienced a lot of painful and difficult experiences, and help people express themselves in different ways and feel more empowered and achieve their best.
Yeah.
As someone.
Yeah. Nice.
So.
Okay. Cool.
But I have to think about it more.
I know it's hard. It's hard to think about.
That was the first time I've been asked that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, welcome to I'll Go First. I'm joined by a very special guest that was introduced to me by another dear friend, Dr. Elliot Gann. Aaron Rodwin. He is a researcher. He's a social worker, and he is studying at the moment the creative arts. And I'll let you get into that more granularly, but the creative arts and how we can think about different therapy modalities that are just, I think, a little little unusual when we think about therapy. We're not thinking about hip hop, and we're not thinking about podcasts and stuff. We're thinking about
like laying on the couch.
We're totally thinking about laying on the couch. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about, you're working on some really interesting research at the moment. You've developed some really cool curriculum, but first, like, what are you working on right now?
Right. So right now, I spend half my week at a group practice working with.
Wash your hands.
working with clients who are mainly youth and young adults, but also some older adults who experience, with a variety, like anxiety, depression, relationship issues, and all sorts of other difficulties. So I'm doing clinical work half my week, and then the other half of the week I'm working on a NIH-funded research study at NYU in the Silver School of Social Work, which has this grant, which is led by Dr. Michelle Munson, who developed this intervention called Just Do You, which we're testing, which tries to help improve engagement in mental health services among youth and young adults, particularly those who are socially and economically marginalized, receiving care at public mental health treatment centers. So the intervention uses like creative arts, music, podcasts, visual art, and also like some social learning and motivational interviewing to try and help young adults formulate the belief that, hey, I can get something out of coming to treatment, and this can help me achieve my goals, and also trying to reduce their levels of stigma and increase their levels of hope and trust.
Oh my gosh, that's a lot.
Yeah, and trying to orient them in a more positive way to treatment, because oftentimes they drop out, and that leads to
we all drop out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's trying to improve. So because if they don't drop out, they often do better. So
Right. Yeah.
trying to use creative ways to help them do them. Just do you. That's why it's called Just Do You.
I mean, I definitely have thought about quitting therapy. I'm sure listeners out there have been like, why bother going? This is terrible. And yes, I'm definitely stopping. There are so many reasons, not finding the right therapist, like just generally it is terrible to go to therapy sometimes if you don't see how it's good. Like it just takes so long to try and get to a place where you start reaping the benefits because you are building all those tools and those take some time. So like why would you bother?
And
like what are you telling these young people?
And it's not, I mean, it sucks to talk about painful and difficult things in a very traditional way. So who would want to spend, who wants to do that? It takes a lot of courage, and that's why I think creative ways of doing it are important.
You mentioned something I thought was really interesting, this idea of how do we inspire someone to have trust in the process that it will work.
Process.
Yeah.
That's it. I think that relates to some of the work at NYU because you can't trust every provider. You're talking about
but what is trust?
I sort of a sense of how I interpret it is like a sense of you can, I don't want to use the word trust again, but like that you can rely on someone and that you can have confidence in someone to open up about things that are difficult and that you might not feel judged by them.
You're creating, so someone is hoping that their ability to have a safe space with someone. And then you mentioned this in a part of the research I was reading, it's not just the idea of trust, but it's also the idea of trust and hope and how those work together.
Right. Yeah, so that usually trust, hope, stigma, and our sense of identity are like some of the big reasons of why youth in particular tend to drop out of care.
I mean, but I think adults, right?
Adults too. Yeah, it's relevant to everyone.
Yeah, totally.
So finding ways to help make, like this, right? Like I'll go for empower people and to talk about so they don't feel as much stigma and they gain a sense of better trust.
How is it going? Is it working?
Oh, they're just starting to look at the data now. So
that's
been
really
going for
exciting.
Almost 3 years now. A little over 3 years now. So they're just starting to run some analyses to see.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's exciting. I'm excited to see how that. It's always so important to think about different ways. As our board member, Dr. Robin Stern, says, I think very wisely, there are many paths up the mountain for healing. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. So on that point, though, you're also doing some really interesting research with Dr. Elliot Gann and with another Dr. Raphael Travis out of the University of Texas?
Texas State University.
Texas State University around hip-hop music therapy, which I think is so fascinating. I know myself, I never even thought that was a possibility, hip-hop as a therapy modality at all. And when I say therapy modality, I mean it's just a different means of therapy. There's so many therapy modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, there's emotional-based therapy, trauma-informed therapy, there's a million different
ABC,
types.
CBT.
Yes, all the letters. Yes, there's so many acronyms. It's almost like the military. I heard that the military has a million acronyms. That's when you just talk in letters to each other if you're in the service. But I guess you just talk in letters to each other if you're in mental health, practitioner, provider as well. But hip hop therapy is so interesting. And you were talking, you actually come from the area of New York City, Long Island, right?
Manhattan.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Manhattan. Okay. But you went to Hofstra University.
I did, yeah.
Okay. That's why I got it.
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
Hofstra, for those of you listening, is in Long Island. I wasn't totally off.
I didn't go that far away.
Okay. Yeah.
New Yorkers stay close.
You went to Long Island and you were really interested in mental health. You found yourself after your undergrad experience at a homeless shelter. Did you always want to go into mental health? It seems like, go into banking, go into marketing. Why would you want to do that?
I've always been interested I didn't know I wanted to do that when I first got to undergrad. And but I knew I was always interested in human behavior and the mind and the brain. It used to be, I think my major started in political science. We had the debates, the 2012 presidential debates at Hofstra, so that really sparked my interest in policy. And then I was like, all right, maybe
I could see
political
how
psychology, because I also,
fascinating.
but then, then I got into sociology because I was like, all right, well, sociology is kind of like psychology and political science combined a little bit in its own unique way.
Yeah.
And then towards like my senior year, I was like, I think I'm more like in the mental health route. But I ended up majoring in sociology and then a minor in psychology.
Fascinating.
So,
I think it's also cool how people find their niche.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
for
because
sure.
you're doing mental health work with hip hop, that's why I'm so interested in how you like arrived at this spot. So you find yourself graduating with these degrees, and then what made you decide to go into social work?
So by the time I graduated, I knew I had done about like 1 or 2 internships just during my undergrad as in like psychology, mental health. I was at like the Queens County Supreme Court in the drug diversion and mental health court program. So that was like, whoa, this is, it really stimulated me.
And what's happening in that
So people
environment?
it's a newer, well, not that new, but like over the past, I think like maybe 15, 20 years or so, like there's this whole movement of, instead of putting people behind bars for nonviolent offenses that have a mental illness or a substance use disorder, it's instead of incarcerating them because that doesn't help them, it makes things worse. It's sort of mandating them and diverting them into a mental health court or a drug diversion court that they can be like mandated towards outpatient treatment or sometimes inpatient treatment and follow up with the judge as a way instead of being incarcerated.
Is this kind of a new program or approach?
I don't know. No, I think over the past like 15 years or so, but I don't. It's newer. It's a newer way of approaching things, but it's not like brand new.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So you were
So I did that during my senior year, and then
Yeah.
that sort of solidified. All right, I'm definitely interested in mental health. And then I took a gap year, and I knew I kind of wanted to go into graduate school in psychology, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to go the clinical psych route or the social work route or counseling route. There's a lot of different ways to kind of do essentially the same kind of work, but from a unique perspective from each one. And so I got a entry-level job as a case manager at a psychiatric homeless shelter in the South Bronx, which was really intense. And you want me to just go right into that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Like what? Tell me tell us what that was about.
So it was a homeless shelter for men over 18 and over who had a severe and persistent mental illness.
And you're how old at this point?
I am like, I just graduated, so I was like 23 or
so
24.
You're 20, you're just like fresh. You're 23.
Fresh out.
You're in the South Bronx.
South Bronx. White Jewish kid from the Upper West Side.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So it was
you're really setting yourself up for like bonding with with your population there.
Right. And then when I was working there, like that summer, I had been connected with Elliot again, who you had here, and I found out about his work, like using hip hop and beat making as a way in psychology, and I was like, wow, like that's sort of. I've always loved hip hop. I've always loved music, and I really am interested in mental health now. And then as I was working in the shelter, I just noticed that they had just the purpose of the shelter was people would come in virtually off after going into an intake shelter, for the most part, like off the street. They would be placed here. And since they all had a severe and persistent mental illness and a mega history of trauma, they would often be unmedicated, very symptomatic. And it was a very intense setting. There were like metal detectors, security all over the place. There were a lot of 911 calls for fights that would break out, and it can become very chaotic at times. So, did you find that a lot of the homeless population had histories of trauma? Yeah, like almost 100%. Really? Yeah, there's like articles on that. I don't know the exact number, but over 80%. And we were talking that there is actually a difference between, when we talk about trauma, there's actually two camps of trauma. Not camps, but like there's two silos of trauma. Right. So there's the more traditional PTSD, which is like in the DSM, and that's like typically a single event trauma. So like a soldier goes to war, and there's many different forms of it, but like experiences a horrific thing that happens right in front of them, someone dying, someone getting their arm blown off, after that it starts to have flashbacks and starts to have nightmares and starts night terrors and emotionally dysregulated up and down and a lot. And so that's in reliving that experience. They get stuck in that experience. And then there's complex trauma, which is not in the in the DSM yet, but there's been a huge movement of of research on it and studying it, which is that many people have trauma histories who have not necessarily had a single event PTSD-like experience, and that's typically like between the ages of like 0 and 18, at what they call adverse childhood experiences of people who've had like repetitive traumatic events like childhood sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and other forms of that at such a young age when you're like developing these perceptions about yourself and learning how to, like we were talking about, trust, parents and caregivers and
Right.
people, and the brain's so like vulnerable then when you have these experiences that put fear in your body and your mind that really locks in a very different way, and that can span, there's a ton of different health risks that poses for when you grow older. Like there's the famous like adverse childhood experiences study, which they interviewed like 50,000 people, and they found like the people who had like more reported experience, like what they call ACEs,
Mm-hmm.
very specific kind of things that happen, had like much, they were clearly linked to like, heart, like various health outcomes,
it's
like
so
smoking,
fascinating.
heart disease, alcoholism, all sorts of different health.
Yeah, adverse childhood experience. It's a 10-point scale. You can look it up, or 10-point diagnostic. You can Google it online. I know when I did the diagnostic, it's a simple diagnostic. It just is like Aaron's saying. It's have you had a parent incarcerated?
Right.
Did your house burn down? That was one of them, which I
Yeah.
thought was really interesting. And when I took it, I actually had 9 out of 10 of the criteria, and I always am just like, wow, I'm so fortunate that I've had access to mental health care, because anytime I hear about populations who have exposure to long-term stress or trauma, I know that I'm just very lucky that any one of those people in shelters that could have easily have been me, and which is why I'm so passionate about helping people along their trauma recovery process.
Right.
But adverse childhood experiences now is really starting to gain momentum on a national level, which is super exciting. The National Trauma Institute is really starting to have a very big presence in the conversation around child pediatric care. And gosh, I'm like a fangirl of Dr. Nadine Burke in California. She
Great
just,
TED Talk.
yes, she has an amazing TED Talk, and she just became, I think 2 years ago, the California general surgeon. I mean, she's a mom of 3. She's gorgeous. She's a pediatrician. I mean, there's so many reasons to admire her, but she also, like Aaron's saying, has been a massive champion of ACEs. Highly recommend anyone listening to Google it. It is incredibly insightful. And to Aaron's point, too, when we're talking about trauma and the way that developmentally trauma affects us, it's just the epigenetics of how we process that long-term exposure to cortisol and how that deregulates not just our mind, but our body's ability to process cortisol as we grow older. And there's some really fascinating articles that, Aaron, you need to check out from John Hopkins about, and this is interesting because I have a brain disease, but there's some correlating studies being done right now between particularly women and long-term autoimmune issues and the correlation between ACEs as children. So anyway, that's like my side tangent.
Yeah.
It gets me really excited because it is becoming, it's really exciting because it is getting on the table finally after so long. This study was done, I think in 1992, maybe? Yeah.
With Vince Felitti
and
Bruce
he was
Perry.
like a gastro.
I think it was done, I believe, in the Kaiser, HMO.
Right, but I think the doctor, we'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
I don't want to spread misinformation, but the guy who discovered it, he's really interesting and fascinating too, how he came to develop it.
Right, the ACEs scale.
Yeah.
But in the shelter, majority have a significant history of trauma, and going back to what you were saying, we had like therapeutic groups there that were more traditional, like anger management, because people with a trauma history like have anger, and and also just like they were living in a homeless shelter and without housing. There's like a Maslow's hierarchy of you don't have your most basic needs, and of course you're so like these anger management, positive thinking, and but it was often very difficult to engage people in those groups. And it would,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
it's like, you know, do you want to come to anger management? And it's like, not really, no. Or, you know, so.
You said it really well. Outside, we
Yeah,
always
they
have
would-
like a kind of dialogue with our guests beforehand. But Aaron, you were saying that like who would want to go to anger management when you don't have housing? Like,
Right, like they'd say,
I don't want to positive think my way
you want to
into
come to
housing.
positive thinking, and it's like, go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
So I found, so this was around the time I met Elliot, and I was like, you know, this whole idea of using hip hop and mental health for engagement, it just sounds so relevant here. So I proposed this idea to start this group, which was Raphael helped me with, Raphael Travis, and that basically was a more, you know, I would say, like, you know, we're listening to Jay-Z on the second floor, we're listening to Nas on the second floor, and that would attract a very different, more people than.
Do you want to come
talk
have
about
positive
anger.
feelings about
Right.
yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, that's how it started.
So so you started bringing people up. I was looking through the study. I thought I was surprised. I mean, I'm looking through the sort of papers that have been developed around this theory, and the songs that were listed, I was like, oh, Nas and like Jadakiss, who I haven't heard his name in like a million years. Jay-Z, like, yeah. The top one was like from Kendrick Lamar.
Yeah.
I would never ever look at these songs and be like, wow, there's like some therapeutic component of it. But you had talked a little bit earlier also about that these narratives are coming from where hip hop birthed out of. These are places where there's trauma.
Right. And I think that's like the important thing to start with too, that like hip hop evolved in the 1970s out of the South Bronx, which is so appropriate that I was working in the South Bronx too.
Yeah.
Such a connection in the birthplace. In a response to social injustice and harsh community conditions, and it created this outlet for marginalized youth to speak out against these conditions and gain a better sense of empowerment, like Public Enemy, right? Like Fight the Power, right? Like there's all these narratives historically in hip hop from then up to today that have just narratives of community and self-improvement and the betterment of their communities and individual. So Kendrick, Nas, like these are just like a handful of people out of so many. But when we listen, like Kendrick's song "I," we use it because it was like such a popular song too on the billboards. That the whole narrative is talking about like how he loves himself.
Yeah, totally.
And then at the same time, he's talking about that he's been dealing with depression ever since an adolescent. He could never see the blessing. You know, he has these whole. So he's like talking about how he loves himself.
What were the lyrics?
There's a line. He's like, I've been dealing with depression ever since an adolescent, and then I could never see the blessings, and then the rest is a little choppier.
Yeah.
But,
no, that was good. That was good. I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. But yeah, that. So talking about like this gaining this self-acceptance of himself, and then also, you know, millionaire successful artist, you know, talking about that he's dealt with depression and, you know, anxiety and all these mental health difficulties since a young age. You know, that's something when we're talking about stigma, right? Like, so having someone listen to that and be like, wow, like this person is really successful. I'm not alone in this. Like, Kendrick talks about this. J. Cole talks about this. Nas talks about this. So many different artists, not beyond hip hop too, just talk about all these things that they've been through, and that can be such a powerful tool to help feel less stigma around talking about mental health.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard to put words to stuff. So hearing these people that, you know, this, like, I think you were saying
validating.
Hip hop is the largest genre in the world.
Yeah. I believe it's the most streamed genre of music in the United States. And I think in France, it's the second most.
Wow. Wow. It feels States, like it's right. This opportunity is like right in front of us.
Right.
So you were talking about when you were talking to the people that you were serving in this shelter, saying like, come up. We're listening to Nas or whatever on this other floor. Or is there like a story that sticks out for you about like somebody that comes to mind that really like was impacted by this?
Yeah, many. So like when we were coming to the second floor, just like an segue into that, it was the group that I started running was based on Dr. Raphael Travis's Muse model that he developed, which is this model of individual and community empowerment. And it
What is empowerment? Because we hear that word tossed
Right.
around all the time. Like, what is
Right.
that definition?
So empowerment. So creating, the way I understand it is creating a space to help people feel more able to make decisions that they want to make, and more a greater sense of confidence in themselves, and a greater sense of power that they have in the context of disadvantages that they're facing and obstacles that may be in the way. So they can feel more like they're able to attack
They're able to
something.
do
They're
it.
able to do it.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
there's not as much hope there.
Right. Yeah.
And so the model goes from 5 dimensions of esteem, resilience, growth, community, and change. And so during the group, each week we would do a different dimension of that. Like we would start with esteem. And for esteem, we would use a song, for example, there's many, but like Kendrick, because he's talking about I love myself, right? So then that would be a segue into having a conversation about, we would first talk about, all right, when you listen to this song, is there anything that stands out? Is there anything that comes to mind about self-esteem? And then that we'd have a conversation around that, more general, about just analyzing the lyrics of the song, listening to it together. And then we would say, how do you feel some of this might relate to your experience? And then it starts to become more personal. And then we usually would end with like a writing activity where we put on the beat, which is regulating for trauma too. And we would just sit and reflect and sort of listen to the song. Some people would draw, some people would write a poem, some people would write a rhyme about, write a quick rhyme about 5 things you love about yourself. All right. And so
that's hard to do.
Yeah. Or some people would draw, express themselves in different ways, or some people would just sit and listen. There was no right or wrong way. But then, so with that, and then resilience would be a song about resilience and, growth, community, change. And so it would align with those themes. And sort of what you were saying, like a story about someone, I remember it was actually the first group that I ran there after I proposed the idea. I started this maybe like 2 months into my job there. And the first group, there were a lot of people who showed up. There were like 12 people who came, and sometimes a lot of the groups would get like 0 to 3 or 4.
That's huge.
So there were groups that it wasn't. There were sometimes it was like 15. There were sometimes it was 10. There were sometimes it was 6. So it wasn't every time, but on average there were definitely a higher amount of people who would come to that. It's more engaging. And so this client, he had could call him Bernard, right? Like he was older, he was in his later 50s, and he had a long history of being in and out of homeless shelters. He had spent a long time in prison. And because of this history, he was like one of the most long-standing clients at that shelter when I arrived there, and he was on my caseload. And he was it was so hard to place him into supportive housing because of his history. He had a criminal history that made housing providers, which is another sense of discrimination that people face, right? That keep people in homeless shelters. And he never, very quiet, really would never talk much. He would keep to himself. He had a history of schizophrenia, so he had a lot of the negative symptoms of it, which were more like blunted affect, difficulty expressing emotion.
What is blunted affect?
A sort of very constricted facial expressions, and not as smiling, or sort of, it's very sort of withdrawn and numbed almost. You could think of it.
That's so. This is a total side note, but when I think of, maybe this is my own bias too. Like when I think of schizophrenia, I have a totally different version in my head of what that looks like. But schizophrenia isn't always like extraordinary,
right? Like
in its presentation.
What we see in the movies.
Yeah, totally. In its presentation, can be really actually the opposite, very minimal. It doesn't look like we think it looks.
Right. Yeah. Like some of the more classic side of it, maybe like the positive symptoms, what they call it, like the hallucinations or delusions. But he had a lot more of the negative symptoms, which are like a bit more socially withdrawn, emotionally sort of blunted, and he wouldn't talk much. Sort of very flat facial expression often. And he came to the group, and we were listening to that first day song by Nas from his Illmatic album, It Ain't Hard to Tell. And during the second half of the group, where we were just listening to the instrumental and there was a writing prompt of people were reflecting, he wrote like an entire poem which I cannot recite off the top of my head because I don't have it memorized, but he just opened up and wrote this whole poem, which was really well written and really had a lot of rhyme to it. And he was just talking about his childhood and positive memories that he's had with like eating different food with his family over the holidays, and just like reliving some of these positive experiences that he said were evoked from listening to this song, that there were certain lines that brought
so
that
it's
out
like it
of
came
him.
alive a little bit,
Yeah.
given that he was like kind of, you were saying the word blunted,
yeah.
but he was able to like express, I mean, that's like
It's
huge.
It's something about
like
the
broke
beat.
through something.
Yeah, he started it with like this beat. When I listen to it, it brings me back to this time in my life. It was the beat in It Ain't Hard to Tell is it has like a jazz feel to it, and it's an uplifting sound. At least that's how, when I hear it, that's how it comes off to me.
Yeah.
And it seems to have, it brought some of those memories out of him. And so there were some people in the group who came up to me after, and also another person, which was kind of funny too, one of their case managers, and said, I've never heard that man speak before.
Wow.
So he spoke and he expressed himself, and that it may sound like it's
remarkable.
not a huge thing,
No,
but
that's
like
huge.
that's so big for someone who's been in, had such a history of like being institutionalized
Yeah.
and had,
That's
a
beautiful.
marginalized voice, to be able to sort of see other people react like, wow, like clap for him after he shared that, like that's a really powerful experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So,
amazing.
that was pretty touching. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Wow. I can like see that too
Yeah.
for you. Like, wow, that
It
is like
was.
really amazing.
I was pretty shocked because he was a very quiet person and very, very sweet guy, but he had a lot of difficulties with expressing himself.
Yeah, of course.
And also, like, why I feel like these modalities are so helpful, just music therapy, art therapy in general, is because, especially in a homeless shelter, and even in arguably a lot of mental health systems, you're constantly questioned about symptoms that you have,
Yeah.
You're identified by, especially in these public systems of care, like in prison, in the homeless shelters, you're constantly being scrutinized and questioned by problems that you have. You're non-compliant with treatment. Your symptoms are a problem, anger management, you have anger issues. There's all these sort of stigmatizing things that having a more strength-based approach to something can be, I feel, is really important.
And you say strength-based, that means
Strength-based, that
people-
we're, like something like, I consider, having a group that's specifically focused on anger management or positive thinking I sort of hear in that an assumption that the person doesn't think positively, or the person has problems with anger. And while that may be true, I mean, for many of us, I think we have anger, right? And going at it in that way can be very stigmatizing. And so having a way that you're helping someone with their anger or think more positively in a way that's not specifically, identifying them by that problem is what is more of a sort of based on their strengths.
Yeah,
like, okay,
totally.
because like the hip hop group started there primarily because I noticed that residents in the shelter were listening to hip hop in the cafeteria. Like they were just doing this.
Right.
This was their way of relaxing. This was their way of coping in some ways. This was what gave them pleasure. So it was based on, it wasn't just saying, oh, let's use hip hop because we're in a homeless shelter in the South Bronx, but more, okay, like they demonstrated a connection to this hip hop culture just naturally. And so that's like a principle in social work is like self-determination, right? In, for lack of a better cliche term, like meeting the client where they're at.
What is self-determination?
Like supporting someone's ability to make their own decisions and using what's
Okay.
important to them. It's
Yeah.
like a value. And so we should use in intervention stuff that's that the clients value, and not necessarily imposing our more, a Eurocentric or approach on someone.
Yeah, because one of the things that you mentioned in the study and in your work is culturally responsive approaches to therapy.
Yeah.
What is that?
So kind of what we were talking about, that a lot of these, like, CBT, a lot of therapeutic approaches are tested using, not all, but there's many that are tested using primarily, because to do a study you have to have in many cases you have to have a pretty clean sample, in order for it to seem like a
Yeah.
really solid experiment. And many times that's with predominantly white demographics, age groups, and some often like college age. And then some of these interventions are, practiced in community, like in the homeless shelters in the South Bronx or in other, in different communities where the results of the studies that maybe have really positive results for a predominantly white group, right? It's not to say that it's not helpful completely to disregard, but like it doesn't take into account things that are relevant to the specific demographic and culture of clients that you're working with. Right?
Wow, that's so amazing. I mean, it just gets me thinking about, until I met you and Elliot, I had never even thought about hip hop. Like, I don't know. It just feels so obvious now when you are talking about how we listen to music all the time when we ride the subway, you mentioned earlier.
For sure. Or like, it doesn't even have to be in like hip hop, but also I think the bigger point, like what you're talking about, like culturally responsive, something that's culturally relevant to the demographic and the population that you're working with. Like I saw that the clients I was working with listened to hip hop. So like that would seem very important to include that in trying to help them, right? But like if you're working with people who love country music, then maybe integrating elements of that, right? But so
meeting the client where they're at.
Yeah,
I don't think that's cliche at all. Really? Why?
It just sounds very, cookie cutter. Meeting the client where they're at. It's so true. You have to.
One of the things that is part of your work is right now is how to help a patient work collaboratively with their provider or their mental health counselor. That was in like one of the studies, like helping them feel more informed, I guess, during patient care. But I think in general, like from your perspective, because you're now specializing more, not as necessarily a clinician, but you're specializing in studying the art, I guess, of how we use treatment approaches. Mm-hmm. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about like if people are going to counseling, or like how can we be more engaged as like people who are going to counseling to help ourselves? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I take a back seat sometimes. I know I have homework, I guess, but like.
That's a good question. I don't know. I have to think about that more. I feel like a lot of it comes from. That's where I think the research part is really important, and like looking at like mental health, how mental health, like different interventions are designed, and how embedded what you just mentioned is in when someone's developing a different intervention, of like asking that question before it's practiced with someone, right? Of how can this be more engaging, and how can this be more approachable, and how can this be more welcoming and responsive to the people that it's intended to help.
Yeah, so true, so true. Because I think what you had mentioned earlier is like, how do we develop these different coping strategies as well, like healthy coping strategies? You mentioned like 5: growth, resilience.
Right, as part of Raphael's model, it's esteem, resilience, growth, community, and change. So it's the idea of it is starting from me and then going to we. Okay.
What is esteem? Can you like walk us through what these are?
So the esteem dimension focuses on the person, our sense of self and our strengths, our attributes, our skills, our what makes our identity, who we are, and getting in touch with that and exploring that and being curious about that. And because especially like in the shelter, for example, it's hard to when you're identified in many cases by your problems.
Oh yeah,
it's hard
so true.
To have a sense of. It's hard to. That's what we found. Like the esteem one was particularly important in that setting. And then like resilience is focused more on what are some of our strategies that we found helpful for dealing with difficult experiences. And some of them may be weighing, like, substances have been helpful for me to deal with. Some clients would say substance use has been helpful, right? Like it's helped me get my mind off things. And then so it's not about teaching what's right, what's wrong, but more, what are some strategies that you feel could be maybe more helpful in the short term? Like sometimes for some people that could be drugs, or for some people that could be other, versus what are some things that might help me with coping and being resilient in the long longer term, right? What are some other strategies that might support how of me dealing with difficult things in the best way possible?
So it almost sounds like the collaborative part might be coming from like from the creative, like trying to figure this out together in terms of like long term, what fits each person, like individual, like uniquely.
Yeah, again, the whole idea of it is a sort of going through each dimension, sort of collaboratively, and then sort of growth. What are some goals? Like talking about goals, where do you see yourself? Where do I envision myself in 5 years from now, or 6 months from now, or in getting in touch with that, So we would then write maybe a rhyme about that, or a picture of what 5 years from now looks like.
Gosh, these are hard things to do. I don't know that I would want to do them. I mean, it's all that introspective stuff that I think sitting with yourself can be really difficult.
Yeah, and I for that reason it is like that's why like when I've done this, like I think it's so important to create options for people that you don't have to write rap, you don't have to write a song. You could just write down, some people would just jot down like words that came to mind in no specific order of, like that client did that I mentioned, right? Or draw a picture of something. Or some people would just sit and listen to music, right? And the beat. Because like we were talking about before, something like with trauma and all this, when we can have a lot of difficulty managing our emotions and feel very dysregulated and like...
What is dysregulated?
Out of sync, out of rhythm. There's not a rhythm in a lot of emotional ups and downs, and it's hard to like manage emotions, and they keep navigate them in a way that feels like it helps us. So that's where like Bruce Perry, one of the researchers on the ACEs study, who's been like a huge proponent of that, has a video an interview talking about why hip hop is so helpful for people in music, because it's rhythm and it's synchronized and there's a beat to it. And so just listening to that sometimes, even if people aren't writing in these groups, there's something just therapeutic about listening to music, and it's regulating. It could help reduce anxiety, depression, stress.
So it's like the regulation and then the
stress response.
And then on top of that, it's that like amazing narrative that's happening with that relatable narrative, that's that engaging narrative.
Right, yeah.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation around that like Kendrick and J. Cole and all these amazing artists are talking more openly about their mental health struggles. Since you work and since your past work has focused largely with male populations, given that you are a young man yourself, can you talk a little bit about your perspective on stigma when it comes to men specifically?
Yeah, I mean... we still live in it's gotten better, but we still, like, I feel it myself, like we still live in a society where men are supposed to be really tough and, keep emotions in and not express them in therapies more. There's stigma around, I mean, I see it all the time, even in the practice I'm working at now, or like young men, men just channel their fears and emotions in much different ways of like, working too much or, staying at the office really late, or alcoholism, work, in just much more sophisticated ways than to just escape it, right? And so, yeah, I think so. Like you're talking about stigma, having that's where like the podcasts and the narratives and like video clips of people who are like celebrities talking about mental health is so, I think, helps with stigma, right? Because it's like, okay, like, yeah, this is normal. We all go through this, like, as human beings.
When your friends find out that like you work in mental health, like your other guy friends,
like
are they like what?
Who work in who like work?
Yeah,
a friend
who work
works
in finance,
or something.
Are they like what? Like
I have
why?
I have one friend who sometimes he worked in finance, and sometimes he's like, so how was your day today? And this was at a time when I was working at a psychiatric emergency room.
Oh wow!
In my second year internship, and I was like describing a few cases that I saw that day, and he was like, "What? Like what?" Yeah, it's a very different type of work. So I just sometimes explain a lot.
It's very different. I think when we think about mental health, we don't realize how much creativity we get to use with these kind of fields. It can be a lot of fun. I mean, for lack of better terms, it can be really fun.
Yeah.
What would you say to, I mean, obviously there might be people listening who have male people in their families or have partners. Like, do you have any words of wisdom that you can offer us in trying to have these conversations
About mental health more easily.
with the men in our
men.
lives?
I don't, I think it goes back to like talking about it in creative ways, and part of it's just societal that like more and more the more like NBA players are coming out talking about their mental health struggles, and more people who we may perceive as like being tougher, right, are the more sort of people are making themselves vulnerable, and particularly like men who are famous. I think that helps a lot with that, sort of has a trickle down.
Yeah, so people, exposure, yeah.
Yeah, and like through music and arts, and I think there's all these other. I think that's why the creativity part is so important.
Yeah, totally.
To address stigma.
When you think about, because like I said, what we've been saying is that you're doing such unique work. I think I've often said that like there's so many ways that we can figure out our purpose. Do you have any thoughts about, if someone's listening out there who's like, I'm really passionate about this one thing. I really love hip hop, but I don't know how those can go together. Like, how did you kind of land on what you're doing right now?
What was the first part?
How did you, like, I'm really good at this one thing. I'm really passionate about this other thing. I love this one thing. Like, I don't know how these all come together. Like, how did it come together for you?
I think I've always been interested in the human mind and the brain and suffering that can happen, the different things that can go wrong with, during our life, and how we respond to those situations. And then I've also been an avid lover of hip hop and music myself. So it just felt very natural.
So it just like came together.
It just came together. I mean, through meeting Elliot and then Raphael, they sort of existed a bit independently of each other. I didn't really think as much about blending the two until then.
So it sounds like it's just about keeping your eyes open and like getting to know yourself and making sure that you stay open and creative to the things that might fall in your path.
Yeah. I couldn't have planned that. I mean, I had a sense I wanted to go into mental health or definitely social science, but I would never have guessed that. Like I wouldn't have known like hip hop would have been like that. Just is something that sparked my passion, and I just really love this kind of work. And
so it's so cool.
Yeah.
It's so cool. Do you have, as we come to a close, do you have a song that you like love the most, or an artist that you respect the most?
Like a top 5. So a favorite song of mine personally, or a song that I think or the top artists that I think are the best.
I mean, either.
It's defined in so many.
Either.
Well, I'd say one of my favorite songs related to mental health, and also just in general, and also one of my favorite artists is Jadakiss, so the song, I may be a little biased that we used it in the group, but the song "One More Mile to Go."
Okay, I'm making a note of this.
All like the first line in that song. He says, "When it all seems hopeless, real hard to focus. Simple dilemmas become hard for you to cope with." I could probably go for the rest, but it just is such an uplifting beat in the hook, and it has this whenever I listen to it, it makes me feel inspired and, motivated, and, it just talking about I think in that song, there's nothing that it's relatable to everyone, regardless of your life experiences, right? That like everyone is going to experience a time in their life where there's another line in the song when it's like, sort of feeling, when feeling really cloudy and losing your vision, right? And I think that some of these lines are just so relatable that they just resonate in a way that feels really like uplifting and powerful.
I love it. Awesome. I love it. Is there any way that we can kind of get more information about the work that you're doing?
Well, so there's there's 2 articles that Raphael, Travis, and I wrote about sort of the experience working at the shelter. And they're right now, this study I'm working on at NYU, it's led by Dr. Michelle Munson. She has the youth and young adult mental health group at NYU Silver, has a website, and it talks about these different projects and some of the things that have been published about it. And Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well,
Check
we
that
will
out.
definitely link to that at the bottom. Thank you so much for your wisdom. It's
Yeah.
always amazing to hear from different people who are working
Yeah.
on this issue and this topic and supporting people in different ways. You know, it's really exciting.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
This is great.
totally. Awesome. Matt, I'm just going to do an intro for him. I will meet you in the
Cool.
lobby. I'm just going to do an intro really quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
It does, right?
Yeah. All right. I'll be out there.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out what to say for him. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick one for him, if that's cool. Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Jessica Minhas, and welcome to I'll Go First. Oh, I need to start that over. I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Jessica Minhas, and welcome to I'll Go First. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting you on your journey of hope, healing, and freedom. And today, on this episode, we have a really special guest, Aaron Rodwin. He is a researcher who focuses on hip hop as a therapy approach for trauma. So cool. He is going to talk about how he found this unique passion and how you can too, and how this work is really changing the lives of a lot of people in homeless shelters. So cool. I can't wait for you to hear it. Let's get started. Good enough.